Interested in learning about wine, but not sure where to start? You're in the right place. Welcome to the Cork and Fizz Guide to Wine podcast. I'm your host, Haley Bowman, and I'm so glad you're here. I'm a wine enthusiast turned wine educator and founder of the Seattle-based wine tasting business, Cork and Fizz. It is my goal to build your confidence in wine by making it approachable and lots of fun. You can expect to learn everything from how to describe your favorite wine to what to pair with dinner tonight, and so much more. Whether you're a casual wine sipper or a total cork dork like myself, this podcast is for you. So grab yourself a glass and let's dive in. Welcome back to the Cork and Fizz Guide to Wine podcast. Today's episode, we're going to be talking about wine additives. And if you're like, wait, what do you even mean, right? So if you haven't heard, there is this sense that wine, of course, is made with grapes, right? But there are additional things that can be added to your wine, and they don't have to be on the label. And so that does sound kind of scary. And I think wine additives get a bad rep because we just put them all in one category. But I hope after listening to this podcast, you'll kind of have an idea behind wine additives that are just part of normal winemaking and really shouldn't be that scary, and maybe the wine additives that are like, I don't know how I feel about that. I don't know if I want that in my wine. So we'll try to kind of put those into two different categories and explain why they're used and what they do. I think a lot of this idea with the additives and wanting to have wine with no additives also comes from that big push lately for natural wine. And I have nothing against natural wine. In fact, most natural wines I've enjoyed are very good. But some of them are just not well-made wines because they're not taking advantage of these additives that are used in common winemaking. They also kind of have a tendency to put down any wines that are not considered natural and do use additives, even if they're super common and have been used for centuries. So what I want to do is just talk to you about all these different additives and then, just understand them before we dump any non-natural wine down the drain or give up on anything that has anything other than grapes in it. So without further ado, let's get into this episode all about wine additives. So to start, let's talk about the difference between an additive that is used commonly in winemaking. So this is often referred to as a common additive, and these assist with standard winemaking versus a corrective additive. A corrective additive is used to solve problems in winemaking, and these are often due to either poor grapes, bad climate, bad winemaking. It's kind of the idea that you're trying to fix something that went wrong. And also keep in mind that while these are all called additives, many do not remain in the wine by the time you drink it. So they're added and then either removed, just naturally they dissolve or something else happens. So not all of these are things that you're actually consuming while you are drinking the wine, whereas some of them do remain in very small percentages. Another thing I think that is really good to talk about before we kind of get into all of the different additives is thinking about the goal of the winemakers when they're making the wine, and specifically thinking about a small producer versus commercial production, right? So our small producers, they're going to embrace the subtle nuances that vary from year to year, right? So if you've been listening to this podcast, you know that every year, when we take the grapes, they're going to be a little different because the weather that year affects those grapes. And so a small producer is going to be fine being like, yeah, the 2020 is going to taste a little, I don't know, let's say it has more alcohol than your 2019 because 2020 was a warmer year or something along those lines. And I think the people who are buying wines from small producers, they understand that. You know that you're not going to get the exact same wine year after year. It's going to be a little different. And honestly, for me, that's exciting. It's very fun. For many wine nerds like myself, there's a type of flight you can have where you try multiple wines, all from the same producer, the same variety, and you just change the vintages. It's called a vertical. And so you can actually taste the differences in the years based on what either the winemaker did or what the weather was like, which is kind of cool. Now, compared to a small producer, a commercial producer, their goal is to create a consistent product each year, and they're under a lot of pressure to do this. This is more so the wines you're going to see in your grocery store. And this is where vintage doesn't really matter as much. Like sometimes they might not even put the vintage on because it's not important, but they're trying to produce the same wine that you had 5 years ago. It should taste the same 5 years later. Like that is what they're producing. They want to make it so that you know what to expect. In this case, commercial producers, I kind of think of them more as like more similar to like folks who are making like soda or chips or snacks or something like that, where like they are truly trying to produce the same product every year. And so with that, and because we know grapes are different every year, they need to use additives in order to produce that similar product every year. So I think that's just a good thing to keep in mind of like, what's the goal of the winemaker here and why might they be using some of these things? Just a quick reminder, if you are not on my mailing list yet, what are you waiting for? I would love for you to join. When you do, you'll get a free shopping guide that has 15 of my favorite wines under $15. Head to corkandfizz.com, scroll down to the bottom, and there'll be a little section where you can join the mailing list. I send out a weekly newsletter filled with wine tips, recommendations, special offers, and so much more. Now, let's get back to the show. All right, now we're going to get into some of the common additives. And many of these, as a wine expert myself, I am not concerned about. These are things that are commonly used in winemaking. Many of them have been used for centuries. And so when we say additives, and again, like many natural winemakers won't use any of these because they are considered additives. But at the same time, don't let it freak you out when drinking a wine of like, oh my gosh, this has additives in it. Like, yes, but they were used during winemaking and it's totally normal and totally common. First one we're going to talk about gets a lot of bad rep, gets a lot of bad attention, and this is sulfur or sulfites. And so many believe that sulfur dioxide or sulfites are to blame for the headaches that you get after you have a glass or two of wine. The thing is, this sulfur is highly unlikely to cause headaches. Sulfite sensitivity only affects about 1% of the population. And that is exactly why that 1% of the population is why bottles are required to say contains sulfites. It's for those people who do actually have a sensitivity. Now, we'll talk about this a little bit later, but I do find it kind of wild that they are required to say, like, contain sulfites, but wines are not required to say, like, we used a non-vegan fining agent. And if you're like, what are fining? We're going to talk about fining agents, I promise. Or like we used like a fish bladder for fining. And it's like, well, what if you're allergic? Like, I feel like those things should also be said, not just the sulfites. Anywho, that's a conversation for later in the podcast. Stick around, I'll talk about it more. But again, sulfite sensitivity only affects 1% of the population. And also, here's this. Wine usually has about 150 parts per million of sulfur added. Dried fruit, on the other hand, has about 1,000 parts per million of sulfur added. So if you don't get headaches when you eat dried fruit, but you do when you drink wine, I don't think it's the sulfites that are doing it for you. Now, why do we add sulfites to our wine, right? What's the point? Could we just do without it? Not really. For one thing, sulfur is actually a byproduct of fermentation. So even if you don't add any sulfur at all or any sulfites at all to your wine, there will likely still be some in the wine. And that's because it's produced naturally during fermentation. However, additional sulfites are often added to kill unwanted bacteria and yeast in the winemaking process. Essentially, it helps to prevent the wine from spoiling. The highest amount of sulfites can be found in sweet wines and white and rosé wine. So a lot of people also associate, oh, I can't drink red wine because it has a lot of sulfites. Actually, red wine has less sulfites, believe it or not. The jury is still out on whether wine can age, right? So if sulfites are used to prevent wine from spoiling, we're still trying to figure out if wine can age well and still be good with lower levels of sulfites. More and more wines are, they started making wine with less sulfites a little while back. And so some of those are starting to age and we're starting to see what the result is of that. We're still kind of figuring it out. So for the most part, most winemakers will add some sulfites to their wine to keep it from spoiling and keep it a little more shelf stable. All right, our next additive, I think, is like one of the most like obvious. I've talked about this a lot with wine, but I think we sometimes forget that it can be considered an additive, and that's yeast. So yeast is what turns grape juice into wine. It converts the sugars in the grape juice and turns them into alcohol. And what yeast is used when making the wine can greatly affect the flavor of it. Now, some winemakers would prefer the ambient yeast, and this is the yeast that is present on the grape skins and on the winery equipment. This is what natural winemakers will use. They will not add any yeast at all. They will just use the ambient yeast that exists. The only problem with this is that yeast can be unpredictable and uncontrollable. It could go very slow. The fermentation process could take too long. The yeast could also die before it finishes converting all the sugar to alcohol. So in this sense, a lot of winemakers will create a custom cocktail of cultured yeast. Or they'll even it's kind of like thinking about making your own starter for sourdough, but they'll make their own kind of yeast cocktail and they like the results of it. I've actually seen a winemaker once brought out a binder full of different yeasts and what you can expect the wine to be like when you use this yeast. And so it's hard to say with I think some people are like, no, you should just use what's on the grapes. That's what's best. Versus well, but if you use yeast is still a very natural substance. We need it in order to make the wine. So again, I'm not worried if, somebody says, yeah, we used blah, blah, blah yeast or we created our own starter, to get them going versus just using an ambient yeast. In my opinion, this is a totally natural additive and I wouldn't worry about it too much. Along with the yeast, winemakers might choose to add yeast vitamins. And this is essentially the yeast benefits from vitamins, minerals, or any other chemical compound that helps keep them alive during the fermentation process. So, for instance, there's a B vitamin that helps keep the yeast happy in higher alcohol wines. Again, you got to keep that yeast alive so it can eat all that sugar and turn it into alcohol. A couple other examples of common additives. So again, these are ones that are used very commonly during winemaking. One, we have lactic acid bacteria, and this is created via malolactic fermentation or potentially added if we don't get enough of this. This is the acid that you find in milk products, and it makes the wine a little more smooth. You'll find it, most red wines will go through malolactic fermentation, and then some white wines will go through it. Things like Chardonnay very commonly goes through. It's not what gives it the butter flavor. It just gives it a little more smoothness. It basically takes the malic acid, which is what you'd find in an apple, and turns it into lactic acid, which is what you'd find in milk. So it just kind of smooths it out. Along those same lines, oak barrels could be considered additives, right? We're changing the wine in some way here. And what's also sometimes used are oak chips, believe it or not. So whether the winery does not have enough money to buy oak barrels, it's also better for the environment, technically, to use oak chips instead of oak barrels. So you'll just add a bunch of oak chips into your wine, which is probably in a stainless steel tank, I'm guessing, or maybe in an older oak barrel, and you want to add some new oak flavor to it. Now, obviously, the oak chips do not stay in your wine by the time you drink it. They are removed. This is another example of one of those where it affects the wine, but you don't actually consume it. The last common additive that I want to talk about are fining and clarifying agents. And I talked about these a little bit before. These are what can make your wine not vegan or not vegetarian. So fining is a process. Think of it as filtering, but another step further. So after a wine has been freshly fermented, it goes through a period of stabilization. Now, fining agents are added during this process to remove unwanted characteristics. And these fining agents don't remain in the wine. So what happens is you add a fining agent to the wine. Particles in the wine bind to that fining agent and then fall out of the wine. They basically get stuck together and then get too heavy and fall to the bottom of the barrel. Those particles stay at the bottom of the barrel or the tank, and then the wine is strained off the top. So now that you kind of have an idea of how it works, let me give you some examples of some fining agents. So some non-vegan ones that have been used For hundreds of years, the most common one is egg whites, and it's actually this protein in the egg white called egg albumin. Albumin? I'm probably not saying that right, but it's egg whites. These have been used for hundreds of years. Winemakers would essentially, I doubt they do it like this now, but hundreds of years ago, they would just drop an egg white or two into a large barrel of wine. The protein in the egg white would bind to the free proteins suspended in the wine, which would then drop to the bottom of the barrel, and winemakers would simply strain the wine off the top and leave the sludge. This process is called fining and racking. Some other non-vegan fining agents include isinglass, which is the dried swim bladders of fish, and casein, which is a milk protein. Now, there are wines that are labeled vegan, and they can go through the fining process. A lot of natural wines will actually choose not to go through this fining process as well. It's not like these proteins that are in the wine are bad for you. They can just make the wine a little more hazy and fuzzy. And so a lot of times winemakers will choose to fine so they can have a clearer wine, especially with white wines. But there are also vegan options. So plant proteins, bentonite, which is a type of clay, and activated charcoal are 3 options for a vegan fining agent. Oh, one of the other non-vegan ones that I've heard of is crustacean shells. And this is one where actually personally, well, not personally, but someone I know, my mother-in-law, is allergic to shellfish. And so knowing if a wine has used the shellfish shells or not is something that she would like to know getting into the wine. She does not have a sulfite sensitivity, but she is allergic to shellfish. So it's kind of one of those things where, like, if you have to put that there's sulfites in the wine, shouldn't you also put that there's been like egg whites or there's been, shellfish or there is this milk protein that was used? In my opinion, those are also kind of useful things. Those are allergens that should be included on the wine label. I'm not concerned about them, but there are people who would be, similar to the sulfite sensitivity. Okay, now we're moving on to the corrective additives. And remember, these are things that are done to assist the winemaking when something has kind of gone wrong, right? It's essentially to solve problems in the winemaking. I love producing this podcast for you every week, but here's the truth. It's not free. That's why I'm so grateful for sponsors like VoChill, a brand I truly love and use myself. Nothing ruins the perfect afternoon out on the sunny patio like a glass of warm wine. And while ice might seem like the only option, it just waters your wine down. That's where VoChill comes in. VoChill is one of my favorite wine gadgets, and I'm super picky when it comes to gadgets. It keeps your wine perfectly chilled in your own glass. No clunky metal tumblers, no ice cubes, just beautifully chilled wine sip after sip. I don't drink wine in the summer without mine, and I've gotten all of my family and friends hooked as well. My mom used hers so much last year that one of her friends ended up getting one of her own as a Christmas gift. VoChill comes in stemmed and stemless styles and tons of colors, perfect for gifting or treating yourself. Head to vochill.com, that's VOCHILL.com, and use code CORKANDFIZZ for 15% off your order. So the most common one that you'll hear talked a lot about is a substance called mega purple. This is used to boost color and complexity of wine. It's essentially a thick concentrate. It's derived from tincture grapes. Apparently, they are so dark they can actually dye a glass that they're in. And it's aimed strictly at filling kind of gaps in red wines that have color deficiencies. This became super popular when big, bold, dark red wines were incredibly popular. I'm curious if now they won't be used as much because I feel like there's a trend towards lighter reds and we're okay with the fact that it looks lighter in color. Nobody thinks that oh, it's a lighter red, it's not as high quality of a wine. But definitely before. I found this quote that back in 2016, so gosh, that was 9 years ago now? A Monterey County winery, so down in California, the president admitted that virtually everyone was using this mega purple. You'll probably find it in just about every wine up to $20 a bottle anyway, maybe not as much so over that. So again, this is one of those that's being used because the other thing you can do to boost the color of your wine is just blend in another grape or another wine. But if you're trying to save money, you can do the mega purple instead. So essentially it's a shortcut to cover up not low quality wine, but like sometimes, yes, sometimes low quality wine, but sometimes also lighter wines. And they just don't have the money to be able to add a different grape or something like that. But again, I'm curious if you're not going to find this as much because there's not as much push for a darker color, but you might still see it in like red wine blends, Syrahs, Merlots, Malbecs, things where you expect there to be a darker color. Another corrective additive is tannin powder. So tannin, if you've been listening, you'll know that tannin is what makes your mouth feel dry when you've had a glass of wine. It's like you had cotton balls in your mouth. It's produced naturally from grape seeds and skins, along with any type of oak that the wine was put in contact with. However, if a winemaker isn't happy with the amount of tannin in their wine, there is such a thing as powdered or liquid tannin that they can add to the wine. It's fairly common in Europe to use this along with the oak chips instead of oak barrels in order to get a little more tannin and a little more complexity in the wine. Okay, the next one is definitely one that has me a little questioning if I'd want to see this in my wine. This is copper sulfate. And I should say, again, this is one where I'm pretty sure they remove it from the wine before it's actually drank. It's it's an additive that's used to remove hydrogen sulfide and mercaptans. And mercaptans are the thing that can make a wine smell like rotten egg. It's actually a gas that's added to your natural gas so that if you have a leak, you smell it, because otherwise natural gas doesn't have a smell. So this smells like rotten eggs. You will definitely smell that. And sometimes it can come up in the wine. Now, they're not naturally occurring. This smell, this mercaptan, is not naturally occurring in the wine. It can actually come from prolonged contact on the lees. Those are the yeast cells after they die. And so this is a great example of where a problem happened in winemaking. Obviously, it can happen. There's so many things that are going on when you're making wine. But in this case, you're trying to fix the problem that happened during winemaking, whereas the alternative is just to rack the wine earlier, make sure it's not in contact with the lees for too long. And so copper sulfite will be put in the wine to remove that smell, and then it will be removed before you drink it. Okay, the next one is actually really interesting. It has a very unique kind of history to it, and different regions feel very different about whether it's an okay thing to do. And this is adding sugar to your wine. And here's the thing, you're not adding sugar to make your wine sweeter. You're actually adding it because you want more alcohol in the wine. So this process of adding sugar is called chaptalization. And this is a process of adding sugar to the grape juice. So I should say, you're not adding it to your wine, you're adding it to the grape juice before you make wine. And you're doing that to increase the final alcohol level in the finished wine. How does that work? Well, remember, when we are making wine, yeast converts sugar into alcohol. So if we add more sugar into the grape juice, there is more sugar to convert into alcohol, thus increasing the alcohol percentage, and sometimes as much as 3%. The thing is, this process, chaptalization, is not legal everywhere. It used to be fairly common in Beaujolais. This is a region that makes pretty low alcohol wines, and sometimes it was even so cool that they couldn't get a wine over 10%. But I don't believe it's allowed there anymore. I think they're not interested. They also have accepted that they make lower alcohol wines, and we are all very happy about that. But some cooler climates like Bordeaux, France, and Oregon still allow this practice. And in areas where it's not allowed, winemakers can still add sugar-rich grape concentrate to get a similar effect. They just can't directly add cane sugar. But again, they're adding more sugar in the form of a rich grape concentrate. Has pretty much the same effect. Again, this is kind of one of those where you're meh, I kind of just like to see it on the label if it happened, right? Just let me know if this was a thing, because it could kind of mess with you with if the wine is higher alcohol because of the sugar and not because of the grapes themselves, that's not representing the grapes of that year, of that vintage. Along the same lines, so adding sugar to get more alcohol, you can also add tartaric acid to get more acidity in your wine. Some hot climate regions, they will add tartaric acid because the grapes have become overly ripe or they lack a natural acidity. Now, most believe that you should pick the grapes at the optimal ripeness. They should have all the acidity that your wine has. However, there are many factors that will reduce acidity in wine during winemaking, so this is a way that you can fix it. Okay, this last one is a little wild. So this last additive is called Velcorin. Velcorin? I think it's Velcorin. And the long name for it is dimethyl dicarbonate, DMDC. This chemical is lethal in high doses and also poisonous within the hour that it's added, usually at bottling, to the wine, but it does hydrolyze in about half an hour, so it's safe after that. Workers have to wear hazmat suits and follow strict safety regulations when dosing the wine with this. So all of this sounds really scary, right? You're like, why are you adding poison to my wine? And I am actually drinking this? But again, it is not dangerous. It's only lethal in high doses, and it hydrolyzes in half an hour. So it's not poisonous after it's been in the bottle. It's just dangerous when they're putting it in. All that said, it is still a little concerning. The reason why this is used is it acts as a synthetic preservative. It kills yeast and living bacteria, and the most common yeast that it kills, or the one that most winemakers will use it for, is killing Brettanomyces. Brettanomyces, also called Brett, if you've ever heard a wine described as Bretty, or it has there's a little bit of Brett going on. Brett is kind of what gives a wine this earthy, musty, if there's too much of it, start to smell like Band-Aid, or my friends and I call it sweaty leather saddle, barnyard, all those kind of just little too funky smells. Those are due to Brett. And this can happen if the winery, the barrels, the equipment aren't super clean. It can start to develop in a winery. And then sometimes some grapes are just more susceptible to it. Some people really love a little bit of Brett in their wine. Others, not so much. So winemakers might choose to get rid of it, and they can do that with this dimethyl dicarbonate. The thing is, before you're like, oh God, I don't want to have that in my wine, keep in mind, this chemical is also used in fresh orange juice, flavored iced tea, and Gatorade. So it's not just wine that you're going to find it in. Okay, some last thoughts here. So we talked about common additives, we talked about corrective additives and the difference between those, and also the idea that for the most part, the corrective additives are going to be used by commercial wineries because they need to make their product the same as it was the year before, no matter what the grapes are like that come in. My biggest thing, and what I will say on additives and I'm curious what your take is on all of this as well. My take on this is that I'm mostly okay with these additives being in the wine. The thing is I wish they were on the label. I wish they were required to say, these are the things that were, added, besides grapes and, really, besides grapes as the ingredients in this wine, here are the other things that were added. And it just would give consumers a chance to make a choice on their own. And just for you to understand, for example, if they did add sugar, did the chaptalization, it lets us know that, oh, okay, so the grapes weren't actually super ripe, or maybe it was a really cold year, right? Or maybe if you used a certain yeast, it would just be kind of fascinating to know, oh, what yeast did you use in order to create this? It's just the same idea that, I'd like to know what's in my processed food, and I would like to know what's in my processed wine. Because the thing is, it's not required on the label. The only thing that has to do with wine additives that's required on the label is sulfite declaration. And that's great, but there are between 50 to 70 additives that are allowed in wine. So it'd be nice to know which of those are in the bottle. There are actually new requirements as of 2023 in Europe that require allergens and intolerances to appear on the physically attached label of products, while the ingredients and the nutrition details can be disclosed by electronic means with a QR code. But either way, the winery is now required to tell people what is in the wine. I know there's a stigma towards wine additives, which I think is a big reason for not requiring the list on the label. But as a wine lover and enthusiast myself, I'd just like to know more about the wine I'm drinking. And I think this would be nice to know about. These are kind of the questions that I ask winemakers, how did you make the wine? And I think it'd be good to have it on the label. But that's just my take. Let me know. Send me a message. I'm on Instagram at corkandfizz, or send me an email, haley@corkandfizz.com. Let me know what you think about wine additives. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Cork and Fizz Guide to Wine podcast. If you loved it as much as I did, I would so appreciate if you could take a quick second to rate it and leave a review. And if you know a wine lover in your life that would enjoy this episode, please share it with them. In next week's episode, I will be sharing some of my summer wine recs. We're going to go beyond just Sauvignon Blanc and Rosé. You know me, we're not going to keep it simple over here. We'll have some fun, unique wines to share with you. Thanks again for listening, and if you want to learn more about wine, come follow me at Cork and Fizz on Instagram. And if you're interested in exploring new wines and joining an incredible community of wine lovers, be sure to sign up for my virtual tasting club, The Cork Crew. Head to thecorkcrew.com to learn more and use code WINESPECIAL to get your first 2 months for just $8 a month. Cheers!